Well, there is much to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. Here in the studio is Zhang. He is the Washington Bureau Chief for Shanghai Wen Hui Daily. From Portland, Oregon, we're joined by Liang. She's an Associate Professor of Economics at Willamette University. From New York, Robert Hormats is the Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates and a former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Economic, Energy and Environmental Affairs. And Joe Minarik is a Senior Vice President and Director of Research with the Committee for Economic Development right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Liang, let me start with you. Well, we heard from our reporter there that there's some very positive momentum coming out of these talks. How challenging are they, and what's your view on the prospects for a quick resolution, a quick deal here?
Well, I think among the 8 items that the Trump administration has brought forward to the table, some of them are just really unrealistic. The entire package, first of all, lacks some consistency. But if China and Trump wants to reach a quick deal, I think one thing would be the reduction in tariffs and also the slash in the trade deficit. Right? Rumor came yesterday that China has made a concession to reduce the trade deficit with the United States by $200 billion. Although this rumor has been dismissed, it makes sense that for China to make concessions on trade imbalances as well as tariff rates, because these are, I would say, the easiest thing to have any tangible steps. Whereas some other requests from the United States, such as halt subsidies on the core technology developments, and the concession to the stopping the technological transfer through joint ventures and other measures. I think some of these are really an infringement on China's sovereignty and its national initiative and its priority. And I don't think China will make much concession on that front. In terms of trade, I would say, put in perspective, China imported about $1.84 trillion last year. And so $200 billion increase in trade deficit for China would not be a mission impossible, although I would say just wanted to achieve a reduction in $2 billion a year, that is still unrealistic. And it involves the U.S., selling things that China really wants, such as, high-tech products that the United States might be hesitant to do.
Robert, what is your view on a deal being struck here? And just to get back to what Liang said a moment ago about the $200 billion trade deficit, as you said, it's no big deal. This can be done. But the question is, does the U.S. have the productive capacity to close that gap?
Well, I think it has the productive capacity to close the gap. But the real question is a broader one, and that is, there are really 2 schools of thought in Washington. One school of thought essentially is get China to buy more American goods and lower its tariffs, and over a period of time that will help to reduce the trade imbalance. There's another school of thought which says, while that's fine and that would achieve a numerically big deal in terms of Trump's success, there are other more fundamental issues about the China-U.S. relationship regarding intellectual property, trade secrets, business secrets, etc., that the companies are asking the administration to get China to change. Those are more complicated. Now, Kudlow talked about those, changing these policies on subsidies, on support for state enterprises, on intellectual property, but it's being built in a way to the Chinese system is trying to encourage more intellectual property, trying to encourage more technology, building more big industries like artificial intelligence, and those are really part of China's growth plan. So I don't see how China is going to fundamentally change something that is so intrinsically important to its future growth in new technologies and is a big part of the China 2025 program. And we also have to realize that a lot of technological development, a lot of innovation comes from China, and they're growing on their own. So over a period of time, they're going to be less dependent on American technology. And if we start reducing or restricting flows of goods, as we did on GTE, it'll strengthen Chinese companies that say, well, we can't rely on the Americans, we're going to have to do it ourselves. So this is a very complicated negotiation here.
Song, what are you hearing about this trade deal? As Robert just told us, a very complicated deal. Do you see something being struck in the next few days or next few hours for that matter?
I'm positive, and I think this time China is focusing the main complaint of President Trump, that is trade imbalance issue. And as other panelists said, I think China is capable to reduce the trade deficit, but the trade surplus against America. But I would say, I think China disputed with U.S. saying that we are not trying to reduce the trade imbalance. I think China is trying to purchase more goods from America, but these trade imbalance is another issue. But I will say Trump may not give up all other demands which has been proposed to Chinese side last time in Beijing. I think he wants to achieve this goal first, and next time I think he will turn to other aspects of the trade issue, including this Made in China 2025. I think it's a long way to go.
Joe, what are the priorities for the U.S. team that's negotiating this deal? What would they like?
Made a priority of the bi-states with China. The hardest to manipulate is a bilateral trade deficit. The world is made up of 100 countries plus, all of whom trade with each other, and manipulating a bilateral relationship is very tricky. I think Bob propped about the U.S. capacity in the next couple of years than I am. We are an employment rate here in the United States. A massive increase in U.S. sales to China is probably going to have to come from something else, and it may very well be exports from another country. So exports to another country. Right. So what's going on here? I think we're all homing in on the same issue. This is a very complex relationship. The economics are extremely complicated. Making changes in this relationship between a fundamentally market-oriented economy in the United States and one that still has some elements of a command economy in China is going to require a lot of choreography, and we're probably going to have to see that going on over an extended period of time. And when the president makes this high-line demand or at least request that you see a fixed number of dollars coming off of the U.S. China bilateral deficit, I think there's a not insignificant chance that a year, 2 years from now, we're going to look at that number and say, hey, this did not work out the way we anticipated.
What is your view on that, Bob? I mean, is the United States being realistic here?
Well, I totally agree that we're really at full employment, or at least very close to it. And part of what would happen if we were to do this, I think changing the trade imbalance is not an easy thing at all, and would certainly require, in effect, China to buy things from us to reduce the trade imbalance, and that means it buys less from some other countries, and the United States might sell more to China and sell less to some other countries. It's very hard to manipulate because the trade imbalance is not about tariffs primarily. The U.S. is a net deficit country, by and large. It imports a lot of foreign capital. We actually consume a lot of goods from abroad because they're competitive. So, and also it depends on differential growth rates and exchange rates and a whole range of other things. So it's very hard to pick the exchange, the trade balance and manipulate it by $200 billion. I totally agree that it is not an easy thing to do. But I totally agree that is Trump's preoccupation. Yeah. That is what he focuses on, trade imbalance. He looks at these things as fundamentally the result of various kinds of inequities in the trading system. So I think the Chinese, to deal with that, are going to try to find ways, maybe buying more agricultural goods, maybe buying more natural gas, maybe buying more energy products of various sorts to try to change it. But I totally agree, it's very difficult to do, and you just can't simply single out the trade imbalance and just by the wave of a magic wand change it. There are a lot of fundamentals that go into that, and it's not easy to do.
Right. Yan Liang, President Trump, of course, has been talking about a range of issues on this trade dispute with China. He's been talking about that trade deficit. He's also been talking about intellectual property issues. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
China has taken out hundreds of billions of dollars a year from the United States. And I explained to President Xi, we can't do that anymore. We just can't do that anymore. It's a much different situation. But with all the years and all the years that you've covered, trade and nations and wars and everything else, you've never seen people come over from China to work on a trade deal.
So, Yan Liang, the Trump view or the Trump strategy, if we want to look at it that way, is that the victim in all of this has been the United States. It's the United States that's been taken advantage of, and China has to fix that. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I think portraying that the United States as a victim of international trade is totally absurd. First of all, I think the obsession about trade deficit is misleading. Trump has repeatedly talking about the $500 billion trade deficit, which is an overstatement. If you look at last year, the trade deficit is actually $375 billion on goods, and the U.S. actually has a trade surplus in service with China on the order of $33 billion. And the country of origin type basis of calculating trade deficit or trade surplus, it's already a very obsolete concept. Now, furthermore, going beyond just fixing on the numbers, if you look at the United States' position in trade, as the U.S. matures into a service-based economy, it is market mechanism that the U.S. imports manufacturing goods from a country like China and exports services to China. And this kind of trade allows the United States to specialize in and focuses on things that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in. This is one important benefits of trade that I think Trump seemed to be oblivious of. Secondly, if you look at international businesses, a lot of American multinational corporations do business with China and reap tremendous benefits from the trading and business relationship with China. Think about GM sells as many cars in the United States as in China and has a 14.7% of market share in China. Nike, 12% of China's shoes market. Starbucks, 8,000 locations at 60 cities in China. The list goes on and on and on. So I don't think the U.S. is a victim here. So yes, I found this argument, this grievance is simply absurd.
Right. Song, let's talk about intellectual property rights. We've heard a lot about this. The main U.S. complaint is that China has been engaging in unfair intellectual property rights practices, forcing U.S. companies to share technology, etc. It's also an issue where China sees its core interests. How difficult is that going to be to resolve?
I think China is in the process to be more like protecting intellectual property, because China believes that now we are becoming a very strong country for these intellectual properties. And we have to divide this issue into two. One is so-called intellectual property stealing. I think it's crazy to call China to be stealing intellectual property from U.S. Companies. I think you can say case by case. This Chinese company is stealing, that Chinese company is stealing. This is case by case issue. But if you say that Chinese companies systematically stealing U.S. Companies' business secrets, that is ridiculous. And I don't know from where this $600 billion US, this number has come from. There's no evidence on that. Another issue is to stop demanding transfer of intellectual property from U.S. companies to Chinese companies. I think it's a regular practice of for most of the developing countries. But the issue is now U.S. is feeling China has become strong enough, so China should stop doing that. I think China is in the process to develop, and in the future we will see less and less kind of demands of technology transfer.
Joe, in the technology sector, how difficult is it going to be for these two sides to come together? I mean, we saw some changes in the American view concerning this company called ZTE. It had sanctions imposed against it. Its American company supplied components to ZTE. Now President Trump is saying, well, there might be a rethink on that. We have to look at the future health of this company. So where do you think that's going?
Well, it's like everything else we've been talking about. It has a lot of facets to it. Among complexities are issues of national security, the fact that ZTE has engaged in practices that have raised serious security issues here in the United States, transferring U.S. products which they've purchased to other countries who are subject to U.S. embargoes, and then apparently not being totally forthcoming about it. That makes it difficult for the United States to deal with that particular trading relationship at this time. The difficulties we have in other areas include the issues of intellectual property. Yes, in fact, I agree with Song, you have a case-by-case situation there, while at the same time it is clear that there are some systemic issues. There are some questions of national behavior that have to be considered. The position of the government of China should be that intellectual property remains the property of the owner, and that engaging in investment in China should not entail the necessary surrendering of intellectual property. So there are multiple dimensions here. When you get into national security, of course, the United States becomes very touchy for very clear reasons. At the same time, we do need trade because of the ability of countries to engage in complex supply chain activities which add value and which enable both parties to make products that are more competitive and to share in the gains of trade and economic growth. So this is going to be something where people are going to have to sit down. I agree with Song, but I also believe that there is a national behavior issue here with respect to China, and the United States is going to be asking for a change of attitude in that regard.
Song, you want to respond to that very quickly?
I think when it comes to this ZTE issue, I think we need to divide this issue into two. One is that I agree that ZTE broke U.S. law by exporting U.S. goods to Iran. They need to be punished. But another issue is that the accusation that ZTE has created a national security threat to U.S. government. U.S. government is one thing, but it doesn't mean that ZTE should be punished not to import any components from U.S. This is disproportionate.
Bob, what is your view on this issue of the protection of intellectual property rights on technology transfer or technology sharing, as it's put? Is too much being made of it?
Well, it is certainly an issue. When I was in the government, it was an issue, and it remains an issue, but it is company by company for the most part. And I think if there are specific company issues, they ought to be aired and they ought to be worked out. In a broader sense, I think one thing that's very interesting is that over a period of time, Chinese are developing their own intellectual property, and you see more and more that Chinese companies want protection of their intellectual property in China and abroad. So over a period of time, I think there's going to be more and more of a convergence of interests between very innovative Chinese companies and very innovative American and other companies to try to get some general rules or common practices to protect intellectual property. And I think it may not happen today or tomorrow, but over a period of time, that's going to be the case. I think one issue we haven't covered is the investment issue, which is a very important part of this. The United States is now taking a much more restrictive view on certain kinds of Chinese investment, and American companies are concerned that the Chinese will do something similar to some of their investments. So one other dimension of this problem is that there be at least some ground rules on what constitutes legitimate national security reasons for restricting investment and reasons that have to do with issues beyond national security. So that's another dimension to the question of the fusion between commercial and national security issues. You want to find ways that protect your national security. Both countries do. But I think, and I fear, that if there's more and more intervention on certain kinds of investment, that will diminish economic activity and the kind of collaboration that both countries are going to need in the future. So this is another dimension to the problem that will clearly perhaps not be ironed out in these conversations, but over a period of time. And it does affect intellectual property on both sides.
Right. Liang, what's your view on that, on investment? I mean, how will China respond if it sees the kinds of restrictions that Bob was talking about a moment ago being imposed on companies that want to invest here in the United States?
Well, I think if you look at the general trend, the Chinese government has made commitment to opening its markets. Think about the financial services industry, for instance. And so I think, in a way, China does have the intention and determination to, open its market, probably in a gradual process, step by step. But I think that is a general trend. Although I would also say, opening the market and introducing, these foreign companies, China needs to, in a sense, get what it needs, right? Which is, technological sharing and all of these. And let's face it, I mean, a lot of this technological transfer or spillover are not really core technologies. And I think it makes a lot of sense, as Song was talking about, developing nations typically, ask for, technological transfer as a condition for market entrance. And China is still a poor country. If you look at per capita GDP, China is still a fifth of the U.S.'s level. So I think, talking about getting technology from other countries, the U.S. has been the forerunner, in the early years of industrialization. So,
Joe, there is another very little interesting dimension to these talks that are taking place. We talked about ZTE a moment ago, and the possibility that sanctions against ZTE could be lifted. The New York Times says that Trump's motives for that may be diplomatic as much as economic. He needs China's influence with the leader of the DPRK, Kim Jong-un, to resolve the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. He's going to have a meeting with Kim Jong-un very soon. Well, that's on the schedule. Do you think there's some kind of linkage here?
If there's anything that this drama needs, it's more complication. And there's no question that the role of the United States interacting with North Korea at this time is going to complicate these conversations. It's definitely going to be in the mind of the United States. There's certainly an advantage to the United States if at the end of this negotiation, the United States and China can talk about success, if issues that are extremely divisive can be kept off the table and discussed later. That means that the president can go to North Korea when he has his summit with Kim Jong-un in a position where he and his counterpart in China are still good friends. And that presumably gives him a little bit more leverage in the Korean negotiations. So yes, it's complicated, and it gets more complicated by the moment.
Bob, I've only got 10 seconds. Do you see a connection here?
Yes, and I think for the same reasons. I think Trump needs to have a good relationship with the Chinese, because China is so important in the overall Korean negotiations. I don't think he really wants a big trade confrontation with China at this point, because China is an indispensable player on the Korean Peninsula. And he wants to work with the Chinese because they have more influence on the North than he does.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.